What if Russia weren't Slavic? What if instead the Rus Vikings, those fierce Norse adventurers who carved their names into history, had fully colonized the vast Russian lands, stamping them with Scandinavian culture, language, and identity? Imagine a Russia where Old Norse echoed in the markets of Novgorod, where longhouses stood tall on the steppes, where people prayed to Odin and Thor instead of Eastern saints, and where sleek Viking longships cut through the rivers of the Volga and the Dnieper. A Scandinavian Empire rising in the east, blending Viking ferocity with the endless resources of Russia. How different would the world look today? In reality, the Russes who first came as traders and warriors gradually assimilated into Slavic culture, leaving behind names and legends but becoming something far from their Norse roots. But what if that had gone the other way? What if the Vikings had truly stamped Russia as their own and built a Scandinavian empire that endured? If you're excited about alternate history, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave a comment. We're growing this new channel, What If History, to 10,000 subscribers, and we've got many fascinating scenarios ahead that you won't want to miss. This isn't fantasy fiction, and it's not about Thor showing up with a smartphone to rule Moscow. What we're doing here is something far more serious and fascinating, taking the tools of history, politics, geography, culture, and asking whether the Vikings could realistically have built a Scandinavian Russia. Could those Norse adventurers have stamped their world onto the east, creating not just raids and fleeting settlements, but a lasting empire that changed the balance of power across Europe and Asia? And if so, what would that mean for the course of world history as we know it today? The goal here isn't wild speculation or turning history into myth. We'll use the facts we know, the way the Rus operated, the geography that shaped them, the political realities of the time, and push them forward into a plausible alternate outcome. By staying grounded, we can explore this scenario in a way that's both imaginative and intellectually rigorous. So stick around, because by the end of this video you'll see just how radically different our world might look if the Vikings hadn't simply blended into Slavic culture, but instead forged a true Scandinavian empire in the east. The story of the Rus Vikings begins on the rivers of Eastern Europe, where Norse adventurers known as the Varangians carved their way deep into Slavic lands. These were not just warriors looking for plunder. They were traders, explorers, and rulers in the making. They followed the great waterways, the Dnieper, the Volga, and countless smaller rivers, creating a network that connected the cold Baltic to the glittering wealth of Byzantium and beyond. Along these routes, they founded fortified trade posts that grew into towns, the most famous being Novgorod in the north and Kiev in the south. Figures like Rurik, the legendary chieftain invited to rule over the Slavic tribes, became the foundation stones of what would later be called the Rus. His successors, such as Oleg, extended this influence further, making Kiev the heart of a rising power. These Norse leaders weren't outsiders raiding from the sea. They became rulers who commanded respect, levied tribute, and bound diverse peoples under their banners. The early Rus dynasties show us how quickly the Vikings adapted from raiders to kings. To understand their significance, it helps to compare them to their relatives expanding westward. In England, Norse raiders evolved into settlers and rulers, shaping entire regions like the Danelaw. In France, Vikings became the Dukes of Normandy, a dynasty that would one day conquer England itself. The West saw Norsemen integrating and reshaping local cultures, but in the East, the story took a slightly different turn. The Rus weren't just guests. They were builders of states in regions still defining their identities, and here lies our crucial divergence. In reality, the Rus assimilated with the Slavic majority. Over time, Norse rulers adopted the Slavic language, embraced Orthodox Christianity, and slowly became indistinguishable from their subjects. The Norse legacy faded, leaving traces in names and chronicles but not in everyday life. But what if that hadn't happened? What if instead of melting into Slavic culture, Norse settlers had overwhelmed the majority, spreading their language, their pagan religion, and their style of governance across the land? That tiny cultural shift, the difference between assimilation and domination, could have created a state unlike anything we've ever seen, a Russia built on Scandinavian foundations, a Viking empire rooted in the east rather than just the north. And the consequences of such a transformation are staggering. If the Rus Vikings had fully colonized Russia, the cultural and religious landscape of Eastern Europe would look unrecognizable. Instead of orthodoxy becoming the cornerstone of Russian identity, Norse paganism might have taken root as the unifying faith of the land. Picture a Russia where grand wooden temples stood in place of onion-domed cathedrals, where priests of Odin, Thor and Freyja oversaw sacrifices and seasonal festivals that tied the people to the cycles of nature and war. Without the Christianization of the Rus, there would be no Byzantine influence to shape Slavic spirituality. Instead, Russia might have become a northern stronghold of Viking mythology, resisting the spread of Christianity for centuries longer than it did in the real timeline. This alternate cultural foundation would ripple through every layer of society. The sagas, the heroic tales of the Norse gods and warriors, might have been written not just in Scandinavia but across Eastern Europe. Viking runestones could have marked the landscapes from Novgorod to the steppes, recording victories, voyages and dynasties in Old Norse script. The rhythm of life would follow pagan rituals. Midsummer bonfires on the Russian plains, funeral ships sailing down the Dnieper, warriors buried with their weapons to join Odin in Valhalla. Language, too, would be utterly transformed. Instead of the Slavic tongues becoming dominant, Old Norse would have reigned supreme. The names of cities, rivers and rulers would reflect Viking influence. The everyday speech of peasants and nobles alike might have echoed the same words heard in Norway and Iceland. Slavic languages, if they survived at all, would have been reduced to regional dialects spoken in isolated villages, slowly fading as Norse culture pressed deeper into the heartland. Over centuries, Russia would not have developed its Slavic identity, but instead grown into an eastern branch of the broader Scandinavian world. On screen, Viking longships sailing past Moscow, their dragon-headed prows gliding along the riverbanks that would, in this timeline, bear Norse names. The city itself might never have been the Moscow we know, but a Norse stronghold decorated with carved wooden halls and rune-inscribed monuments. But here lies the crucial question. Could such a culture survive intact over generations? Could a Norse-ruled Russia avoid fracturing under the weight of its vastness? Or would its foreign gods and language eventually collapse under the pressure of the Slavic majority pushing back? The answer could decide whether this Scandinavian empire thrived or vanished into the pages of forgotten history. A fully colonized Scandinavian Russia would not only have reshaped culture, but also redefined political systems across Eastern Europe. The Viking way of governance was very different from the autocratic model that later came to define Russian history. Instead of a centralized Tsar holding absolute power, Norse traditions might have taken root in the East, where assemblies known as things brought warriors, landowners, and community leaders together to debate and decide matters of law and policy. Imagine a Russia governed less like a monarchy and more like a federation of Viking councils, each region sending representatives to larger gatherings, echoing the Althing of Iceland or the Jarldoms of Norway. Such a system would have created a decentralized empire, more flexible than the rigid autocracy we associate with Russian history. Local jarls could rule over their territories, owing loyalty to a high king in Novgorod or Kiev, while still preserving significant independence. This structure might have helped bind together the vast and diverse lands of Russia, using Norse traditions of consensus and warrior honor rather than sheer authoritarian force. In this alternate history, Russian politics could look more like a northern republic of warriors and merchants than a realm of czars and serfs. Expansion under such a political framework would be inevitable. The Vikings were not settlers who stopped once they carved out a home. They were explorers who thrived on pushing boundaries. From their base in Eastern Europe, Scandinavian colonists could have pressed further into Siberia, using rivers as highways into the vast, resource-rich interior. Furs, timber, and precious metals from the east would flow into Viking trade networks, enriching this alternate Scandinavian empire. Equally transformative would be the control of trade routes. The Russes already had connections with Byzantium and Persia, but under a Norse-dominated empire, these routes could have been monopolized with far greater intensity. Longships sailing southward might have carried not just goods but also Norse influence into the courts of Constantinople and beyond. Control of these routes would make a Scandinavian Russia a commercial superpower, a bridge between the northern world of Scandinavia and the wealthy empires of the south. Such empire building would shift the balance of power in medieval Europe. Though strong Viking Russia dominating trade routes and uniting its lands through Norse political systems would have posed an entirely new challenge to the Holy Roman Empire, the rising states of Central Europe, and even the caliphates further south. It's a vision of alternate history, where political systems born in Scandinavia shaped not only Russia but the destiny of continents. But with such vast ambitions, one question remains. Could this hybrid empire sustain its momentum, or would the pressures of expansion eventually tear it apart? Geography would have been both the greatest asset and the greatest curse of a fully colonized Viking Russia. The rivers of Eastern Europe, which in our reality allowed the Rus to trade and travel, would have become the arteries of this Scandinavian empire. Longships designed to glide over shallow waters could have sailed deep into the Russian heartland, linking Novgorod, Kiev, and even the distant reaches of the Volga basin. For a Viking people accustomed to coastal raiding and fjord sailing, these rivers would have been highways of conquest and commerce, turning Russia into a networked empire bound by waterways rather than roads. Yet the very environment that gave them opportunity would also test their endurance. The harsh winters of Russia were unlike anything in Scandinavia. Long, bitterly cold seasons would stretch even the most resilient Norse settlers to their limits. Survival would demand innovation, better fortifications against the cold, new farming techniques to endure the short growing seasons, and perhaps even cultural changes in how they viewed life and death. The Vikings were tough, but Russia's winters could have forged them into an even more formidable people, hardened by snow and scarcity. Beyond climate lay the vast steppes, open lands that brought both possibilities and dangers. While the rivers offered control, the steppes offered confrontation. Nomadic tribes like the Pechenegs, Cumans, and later the Mongols thrived in this environment, striking with speed and mobility. Any Viking Russia would be forced to adapt, developing not only seafaring strength, but also cavalry tactics to meet enemies on their own ground. This necessity could have transformed their armies into a unique hybrid, longship warriors combined with mounted steppe fighters, a fusion of Norse ferocity and nomadic mobility. With such military evolution, clashes with powerful neighbors would be inevitable. Byzantium, already a trading partner and occasional enemy of the Rus, would have faced a far more aggressive rival. Persia, too, could have seen Norse warriors pushing trade and warfare deeper into its territory. And when the Mongols finally thundered across the steppes in the 13th century, they would have encountered a Russia, not defined by fragmented principalities, but by a unified Scandinavian empire. The showdown between Viking resilience and Mongol ferocity could have been one of history's greatest struggles. If this Norse Russia survived that storm, if it weathered the Mongol invasions with its hybrid armies and fortified cities, the modern world could look unrecognizable. The global consequences of a Viking-dominated Russia would ripple far beyond its borders, reshaping not only Eastern Europe, but the entire trajectory of world history. Religion alone would see a seismic shift. Without the Christianization of the Rus, there would be no Orthodox Russia to serve as the cultural and spiritual anchor of Eastern Christianity. No Third Rome rising in Moscow, no unifying Orthodox identity stretching from the Balkans to the Russian steppes. The Eastern Church, already weakened after the fall of Constantinople, might have faded into obscurity, leaving Catholicism and later Protestantism as the dominant forces in European Christianity. This absence would alter the very balance of European politics. Without Orthodox Russia acting as a counterweight, the Catholic-Protestant divide might have unfolded differently. Wars of religion, already bloody and divisive, could have been even more lopsided, with no Eastern ally to lean on for balance. Meanwhile, a powerful Scandinavian Russia would shift the entire geopolitical map. Germany and Poland would face pressure on their eastern frontiers, unlike anything they had known in reality. The Ottoman Empire, too, would find its northern campaigns contested by Norse rulers, who blended Viking ferocity with Russian resources. The result could have been centuries of wars fought not between Slavic princes and sultans, but between Scandinavians and Ottomans for control of the Black Sea and the Balkans. And then comes the modern age, where the imagination truly sparks. If a Viking Russia had survived into the era of exploration, Would it have taken on the role that Spain and Portugal played in our history? With its rivers leading into the Baltic and its naval traditions firmly intact, this empire might have been well positioned to launch expeditions across the Atlantic. Unlike the fragmented Norse colonies of Greenland and Vineland that faded into obscurity, a centralized Scandinavian Russia could have re-established and sustained Viking colonies in America. The dream of a Norse New World might have become reality. Imagine New York, not as an English colony but as a Norse trading post. Longhouses rising where skyscrapers stand today, Norse runes carved into the harbor stones, and sagas of the new Vinland becoming part of global history. It's a vision that blends the adventurous spirit of the Vikings with the sheer scale and resources of Russia, and it would have changed the world in ways almost impossible to measure. Could a Viking Russia really have happened, or is this just a fascinating dream of alternate history? To answer that, we have to look at why assimilation was the natural outcome in reality. The Norse who became the Rus were never overwhelming in number. They arrived as a warrior elite and merchant aristocracy, not as mass colonists. Surrounded by a sea of Slavic peoples, it was easier, and politically wiser, for them to adapt to the customs, languages, and religions of the majority. Intermarriage blurred distinctions, and the need to maintain stability across vast, diverse territories pushed Norse rulers toward assimilation rather than domination. In short, numbers were against them. The Slavs simply outpopulated the Norse by such a margin that a full cultural takeover was always unlikely. But alternate history thrives in those cracks of possibility. Could things have gone differently? If there had been a stronger wave of Scandinavian migration eastward, driven perhaps by overpopulation or political pressures in Scandinavia, the demographic balance might have tipped. A larger settler presence could have given Norse culture the critical mass it needed to take root permanently. Historians like Simon Franklin and Jonathan Shepherd, in their work The Emergence of Rus 750 to 1200, point out that the Varangian elite had extraordinary influence despite their limited numbers. If that influence had been backed by sustained population movement, assimilation might not have been inevitable. Another divergence point lies in religion. The conversion to Christianity under Vladimir the Great tied the Rus firmly to the Slavic and Byzantine world. Had Norse leaders resisted that conversion longer, or embraced paganism as a unifying state religion, the cultural assimilation might have slowed dramatically. Pagan traditions could have acted as a cultural anchor, keeping Norse identity alive for generations, rather than allowing it to fade into Slavic norms. So while realism tells us assimilation made sense, the counterfactual shows us there were plausible pathways toward a very different outcome. A Viking Russia wasn't impossible. It just required the right combination of migration, leadership, and resistance to outside pressures. It's that fine line between history as it happened and history as it could have been that makes this scenario so compelling. A Viking Russia might have been the ultimate Scandinavian empire, stretching from the fjords of Norway to the vast steppes of Asia. It would have been a nation of warriors, traders, and explorers, blending Norse resilience with Russian scale. Such an empire could have reshaped not just the destiny of Europe but the trajectory of the entire world, altering religion, politics, and even the discovery of new lands. The sagas of the North might not have been confined to Iceland and Norway, but written across continents, telling the story of a people who turned rivers into highways and winter into strength. But the question remains, would you want to live in a Viking Russia? Would you prefer a world where Norse gods, runes, and longships defined Eastern Europe, instead of Slavic traditions and Orthodox Christianity? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed exploring this alternate history, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and help grow this channel. And when you're done, check out my video on another fascinating scenario where history takes a turn you never expected.